Shut up and sit down.
Hey everybody, this is Tony Day, and today I wanted to talk about the ISO and RAW and the Blackmagic Pocket 4K to try to help people understand what's going on. And I guess there's some misinformation that may be being told by somebody or other people, not sure. I didn't watch their videos or whatever, but and they wanted me to just talk about how ISO affects the raw footage and the dynamic range. And when we look at this, and we're just going to focus on 100 to 1000, okay? I'm not going to talk about the higher range because that's getting into explaining dual native ISO technology is a totally different thing. So I'll try to explain why there's this jump here, but let's just focus here, okay? So if you look here, we've got ISO 400, which is supposed to be the native ISO for the sensor in the low gain setting. So when we go either higher or lower on the ISO, what we're doing actually is adding gain. Now this is either going to be positive gain, where it's going this way, right? We're going up from 400 to 800 to 1000, and then there's negative gain, where it goes to say 200 and 100. Okay, so that's really what's going on. It's basically going to the left or to the right or up and down from these different from this main ISO setting. So you'll notice that as you go up and down, the floor and the ceiling don't really change at all, right? You still have a total of 13.1 stops, and the clip point for either the highlights or for the shadows, they don't change. What this means is that the total dynamic range is not changing at all, okay? And you're probably asking, well, how is that even possible? Like shouldn't it go up and down here? Well, I'll try to explain that a little bit in a minute. So here's this middle line, and how I interpret this is that this is middle gray, okay? So if you're exposing for middle gray, it's telling you you've got 5.5 stops up and 7.6 stops down from that middle gray, all right? So as you go and add negative gain, which is going down the ISO, you can see that it's basically just kind of shifting up. So if you capture an image in any of these ISOs, in the lower ISO, and you're thinking that the sensor is changing anything, it's actually not, okay? There's no, and I'll explain, okay? What you want to do to really kind of understand this is you want to look up ISO invariance. And ISO invariance is essentially where your sensor has like a base level, and then when you're adding negative or positive gain, it's kind of doing it after you've taken the image. The old way of thinking of it, right, is that, you know, the ISO is changing the sensitivity of the sensor. That's how traditionally we've understood ISO. By changing the ISO in post with something like the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, you're not actually adding gain at all when you're shooting RAW. Okay, this specifically is in regards to RAW. So when we talk about RAW, what we're actually talking about is the ones and zeros that are read off the sensor. It's just the information that the camera's giving you. Okay, and then it also places in the RAW file the metadata that holds, you know, what ISO it was shot at, what was the white balance, all that kinds of stuff. And in a sensor that's ISO invariant, and you shoot RAW, if you change the ISO in post, there's no real change to what has been captured. It hasn't changed. The dynamic range isn't any different, right? It's just how, when you change the ISO, it's how it's being distributed that's happening. It's like a curve that's being applied. That's all that's really going on in post, as long as you're within the parameters, okay? So what I'm trying to explain is this last sentence here. This chart shows a relationship between the ISO selection and dynamic range allocation being the key word. Allocation. It's allocating more gain to, you know, the shadows or to the highlights, like trying to kind of give you the exposure that you want to see in the camera. You can shoot technically at any of these ISOs, and as long as you keep the iris and the shutter speed exactly the same, you'll have this situation where you can basically get the exact same shot out of all of them. Now, where this isn't the same is if you're shooting in like ProRes. If you're shooting in 10-bit, you know, HQ, you're now baking this curve, whatever it is, into your shot. RAW does not bake the curve in, whereas if you're shooting ProRes, it will. Like, this will all be baked in. You don't have the option to go up and down in ISO because it's not really an option. You can't really do the same thing, right? So the reason why we're only talking about this in context to 100 to 1000 ISO is because that's where it's ISO invariant. It's between that range. Then when you jump to 1000 to 1250, there's a change happening. You're going into a different native ISO for the sensor, which means that it's an analog change. Like there's something physically actually changing. It's not just software that's pushing or pulling shadows or pushing or pulling highlights or changing the exposure in post or whatever. You're actually physically doing something different, and the sensor is physically doing something different. So if everything that we said was right about ISO invariancy, that if we're in an area of this ISO range that is considered to be ISO invariant, that, you know, if we were to shoot RAW and if we shot 1000, 400, or 100, that the only thing happening is that the metadata would be telling the RAW file that was shot, say, at actually 400, either way. All that would be happening is the metadata would say, okay, you know, when you process this, use 100 or use 1000. It means that if we were to override that and change it, you know, move the 1000 to 400 and the 100 to 400, that means that all of the shots should look exactly the same. If they're all starting from the same point and the only thing happening is the NLE or the software you're using is adding, you know, exposure to it or adding curves to it, then if we were to go backwards and put them all back in the original spot, then it should all look the same. And it should also be true if we went and, say, took 1000 and put it in 100 or 400 and put it at 100, they should all look the same. Okay, so let's actually try that. Okay, so let's look at these 5 shots, okay, that I shot. Now, I'm going to click through them, and you tell me, looking at the images and looking at the scopes, if there's really any difference in the dynamic range. Is this all the same shot? Well, I mean, they're clearly not the same shot because there's slight changes, and that's only because the picture is actually technically a little bit different. If you look over here, the clock change, I didn't think about that, and I'm also using natural light, so there might be barely a tiny little bit change. But I mean, do these scopes reflect that I shot this in different ISOs? I mean, if shooting in different ISOs baked in the dynamic range differences that we see in the chart here, if these were all baked in, then if these were all different shots, then we should see the difference, right? So how did I do this magic? All I did was I changed the ISO setting in each of the shots to 400. Now, am I tricking you? Did I shoot these all in 400? Well, let's find out. Okay, so I'll go in here and I'll reset each of these. Okay, so now when we look at it and we go back and forth in between them, what are you seeing? Okay, so now let me walk through the experiment with you, right? So we've got one shot at 400, which is here. And then here is 100. So if we change it to 400, it looks exactly the same. You see? Everything about it is exactly the same. And then if we do the same thing with 1000 and we go to 400, it looks exactly the same. There's no difference. Okay? The dynamic range when you shoot RAW does not really change. Okay, the sensor's not doing anything different. The sensor's just sensing. It's like just doing its thing. Okay, the processing is where the curves that you're seeing here take place. Okay, so let's try highlight recovery, right? As you can see here, clipped, pull this down, clipped, and we'll look at this one in a minute. But you know, if you look here and you go, man, like, this is clipped, can I save it? You know, boom, you have more, but as you see when we pull this down even further, if it's clipped, it's clipped. You know, there's no saving it. Going from, and if we go here and we do the same thing, the same stuff is clipped. Okay. So because of that, what this suggests is that, you know, you can't really save your highlights. If they're being clipped in like 400, they're being clipped in 100. You know, like it's not going to change. And the same thing is true with the shadows. If the shadows are unrecoverable in 400, they're unrecoverable in 100. There's no difference. Okay. So let's look at 1000. You're like, holy crap, like this is way blown out compared to when we had, this is way more blown out than when we did it in 400, right? So you're like, wow, there's going to be even less information. Well, no, you'd be wrong, because again, there's no difference, right? There's no difference in what you can recover. It's going to be exactly the same. See? It's the same shape on the top. Clipping is clipping is clipping is clipping. Clipping is clipping. There's no difference. If it's clipped, it's clipped. If it's clipped, it's clipped. Okay? So you see that? The little hat? You know, your highlight's wearing a hat. There's a problem. At least in as far as it being clipped. So, you know, if you're thinking, well, I'm going to shoot in RAW and I'm going to shoot in, say, 400 to protect my highlights, there's no difference between 1400 and 100 in your highlights. There's just no difference. It's all the same. Oops. It's just all the same. They all have hats. Okay? So, that's what you need to understand. So again, like I was saying, it's all the same, you know, like you can move up and down in RAW, and that's the flexibility, like to kind of change the ISO settings, but it's not like, I mean, you should still be trying to get the exposure how it's supposed to be. I mean, you should still be doing that. You know, it's just that with the extra RAW, it does let you change this ISO, but really all it's doing is changing that curve, you know. I mean, these are all set to 400. If I set them all to 1000, you know, even from 100 to 1000, you're going to see that they look exactly the same. There's not going to be any difference that you'll be able to tell. I mean, look, it's the same. Like it's exactly the same. The only little twitches you see is this little tiny bit of reflections that are slightly different, or I think it's the digital clock actually that's slightly different in between. That's all you're seeing that's a difference. Okay, there's no change at all in the picture. Okay. You know, this is the easiest I can do. You know, this is the easiest way that I can explain it. If you need more clarification, please, like, I don't know, comment below or something, and maybe I can help you out.